In the medieval world, winter was not a season people looked forward to with anticipation or nostalgia. It was not wrapped in ideas of comfort, warmth, or celebration. There were no cozy sweaters whereupon from soft fibers, no warm electric lights glowing gently through windows, and no heaters humming quietly in the background. Winter did not arrive with decorations, festive music, or the promise of rest. It arrived with fear. There were no grocery stores stocked year-round with fresh produce shipped from distant lands. No refrigeration, no freezers, no guarantee that food preserved in autumn would last until spring. There were no weather forecasts to warn of harsh storms or long freezes. People did not know if the coming winter would be mild or deadly. And most terrifying of all, there was no certainty that spring would arrive before hunger, illness, or cold claimed lives. Winter came slowly at first, almost politely. The air grew sharper in the mornings, leaves turned brittle and fell from trees. Fields lost their green color, replaced by dull browns and greys. Days shortened just enough to be noticeable, shadows stretching longer each evening. At first, people continued their routines, aware that change was coming, but not yet overwhelmed by it. Then winter arrived all at once. Frost hardened the soil. Snow fell and did not melt. Rivers slowed, then froze. The sun seemed to retreat, offering only brief appearances before disappearing again behind thick clouds. The world grew quiet, heavy, and still. What had once felt like preparation now became survival. Animals were slaughtered earlier than usual, not out of abundance, but necessity. Keeping livestock alive through winter required feed that many families could not spare. Better to salt and preserve meat now than risk losing it all later. Fires burned longer each night, consuming carefully gathered fuel. Wood piles shrank visibly. As weeks passed, each log a reminder that warmth was finite. People prepared as best they could, but preparation had limits. Homes were reinforced with whatever materials were available, extra straw packed into walls. Cloth hung over doorways. Animal hides stretched across openings where glass did not exist. Roofs were patched hurriedly. Food was counted, then counted again. Grain sacks were sealed and hidden. Root cellars were checked constantly for signs of rot or freezing, despite all efforts. Once the cold fully settled in, there was no escape. Medieval winters were not about snow-covered beauty or quiet evenings spent peacefully indoors. Snow was not charming when it blocked roads, collapsed roofs, and buried paths. Silence was not soothing when it meant isolation and danger. Winter was not a backdrop, it was an active force pressing in on every part of life. Cold invaded everything. It crept into homes through cracks in walls and floors. It seeped into clothing that never fully dried. It settled into bones and joints, turning simple movements painful. Even standing near a fire did not guarantee warmth. Heat was uneven, fleeting, and often reserved for only the coldest moments. Winter transformed daily life into a constant calculation. How much food could be eaten today without starving tomorrow? How much wood could be burned now without freezing later? How long could illness be ignored before it became fatal? Every decision carried weight. For farmers, winter was the end of labor in the fields, but not the end of work. Animals still needed care, tools needed repair, clothing needed mending, food needed preparation. Long hours were spent indoors performing repetitive tasks. By dim firelight, hands stiff and aching from cold. For travelers, winter narrowed the world. Roads disappeared beneath snow and ice. Rivers became treacherous. Villages grew isolated, sometimes cut off completely for weeks or months at a time. News traveled slowly, if at all. Help rarely arrived when needed most. For the poor, winter was often a death sentence waiting to happen. Without surplus food or fuel, survival depended on charity, which was never guaranteed. Beggars froze in doorways, orphans and widows relied on communities already stretched thin. Hunger struck early and lingered long. Even the wealthy could not escape winter's grip. Stone castles were massive, damp, and bitterly cold. Fires burned constantly, yet warmth never reached far into cavernous holes. Nobles wore layers of heavy clothing and slept under piles of blankets, still waking chilled. Wealth provided food and fuel, but not comfort. Children grew up learning to fear winter. They watched supplies dwindle, saw illness spread, and learned early that the cold was unforgiving. Elders knew winter too well, understanding that each passing year made survival less certain. Winter was not just a season, it was a trial for many. It was the most dangerous time of the year. More people died in winter than in summer. Illness spread more easily. Malnutrition weakened bodies. Accidents happened on ice and in darkness. A single harsh winter could undo years of careful living, and yet medieval people endured. They endured, not because winter was gentle, but because endurance was necessary. Communities gathered together, sharing warmth and resources when possible. Families slept close, pulling body heat. Faith offered meaning when comfort was absent. Hope rested on the slow, inevitable return of longer days. This is the story of those winters, slow, cold, and unforgiving. A season measured not in holidays or celebrations, but in survival. A time when life narrowed to its essentials: warmth, food, and breath. A season that demanded patience, resilience, and quiet strength. It is a story of waiting. Waiting for the sun to rise a little earlier. Waiting for ice to loosen its grip. Waiting for spring not as a luxury, but as a promise of life itself. Cold in the medieval period was not something you escaped when you stepped indoors. It followed you everywhere, silent, patient, and relentless. There was no clear boundary between the outside world and the inside of a medieval home. The same cold wind that swept across frozen fields found its way through walls, beneath doors, and up through the ground itself. Stepping indoors did not mean warmth, at best. It meant shelter from the worst of the wind and snow. The cold remained, settling into every corner and refusing to leave. Most peasants lived in small, one-room dwellings built from whatever materials were available locally. Timber frames were filled with a mixture of mud, straw, and animal dung, a method known as wattle and daub. While this construction provided basic structure, it offered little insulation. Over time, cracks formed as the materials dried, shrank, or shifted. Winter winds slipped through these gaps effortlessly, carrying icy air deep into the living space. Stone houses existed, especially in towns or among the wealthier classes. But stone brought its own problems. Thick stone walls blocked wind, yet they absorbed and held cold. Once winter settled into stone, it remained long after the outside air had begun to warm. These homes felt permanently chilled, damp, and heavy, especially in shaded areas where sunlight rarely reached windows. If they existed at all, were small and uncovered. Glass was rare and expensive. Many openings were covered with cloth, parchment, or thin animal hides, materials that offered minimal protection. These coverings flapped in the wind and let in both air and moisture. At night, frost sometimes formed on the inside surfaces, turning the home into a cold, enclosed cave. Roofs leaked constantly. Thatch roofs absorbed snow and rain, which slowly melted and dripped inside. Wooden shingles warped and cracked. Meltwater pooled on floors, freezing again overnight. Dampness became a permanent feature of winter living, soaking into walls, clothing, and bedding. Floors offered little comfort. Many homes had bare earth floors that turned hard and icy in winter. Moisture from the ground rose into the room, chilling the air. Wooden floors, where they existed, were rough and thin, allowing cold air to circulate from beneath. Straw was sometimes spread across floors for insulation, but it quickly became damp, dirty, and ineffective. Even with a fire burning, warmth rarely spread far beyond the hearth. Fireplaces were inefficient, open structures that allowed much of their heat to escape up the chimney. The fire warmed only those sitting closest to it. Move a few steps away, and the air became cold again. Heat rose upward, leaving feet and legs frozen while smoke lingered in the room. Firewood was precious. Families rationed it carefully, keeping fires small and allowing them to die down whenever possible. Overnight, fires were often extinguished completely to conserve fuel. By morning, the home was bitterly cold. Restarting the fire took time, effort, and luck, sometimes requiring embers borrowed from neighbors. People dressed in layers, but clothing offered limited protection. Wool and linen were the most common fabrics. Wool retained some warmth even when damp, but it was heavy, coarse, and uncomfortable. Linen absorbed moisture easily and provided little insulation. Winter clothing was stiff, scratchy, and often worn continuously, day and night. Clothes rarely dried fully in winter. Damp garments were worn again and again because there was no alternative. Wet fabric chilled the body, drawing heat away instead of preserving it. If clothing froze, it became rigid and painful to wear. Removing it was not an option. Shoes were thin and poorly insulated. Leather soles offered little barrier against frozen ground. Snow soaked into seams. Feet remained cold for hours, sometimes all day. Frostbite was common, especially among those who worked outdoors or traveled long distances. Cold was not just uncomfortable, it was constant. It shaped every movement and decision. Hands numbed quickly during work, making simple tasks difficult. Fingers lost dexterity. Tools slipped from grasp. Needlework slowed. Writing became painful. Frost stiffened joints, making bending and lifting harder with each passing day. Feet ached from standing on frozen ground. Walking long distances in snow drained energy rapidly. Even indoors, cold floors stole warmth from the body. People shifted constantly, seeking the least uncomfortable position, but never true comfort. Breath clouded the air inside homes, visible even near the fire. Conversations were punctuated by slow, visible exhalations. In extreme cold, frost formed on walls and ceilings, sparkling faintly in firelight. Water froze regularly. Buckets left near doors or walls turned solid overnight. Sometimes water froze even indoors during particularly harsh winters. Breaking ice became a daily task. Washing was difficult and often avoided. Hygiene suffered, increasing the risk of illness. Cold invaded sleep. Beds were simple wooden frames filled with straw or rough bedding. Blankets were heavy but insufficient. People slept fully clothed, wearing hats and cloaks. Families shared beds to conserve warmth. Children slept between adults, absorbing body heat. Despite these efforts, sleep was shallow and restless. Cold woke people repeatedly throughout the night. Shivering was common. Dreams were interrupted by discomfort and hunger. Winter did not allow rest. Even illness did not grant relief. Fever in winter was dangerous, as the body struggled to maintain warmth. The sick often worsened simply from exposure to cold. Recovery was slow, if it came at all. Cold also carried psychological weight. Constant discomfort wore down patience and morale. Days felt longer. Small tasks became exhausting. The body never fully relaxed, remaining tense against the chill. There was no moment of true escape from winter's grip. The cold followed people into their homes, into their beds, into their thoughts. It shaped how they lived, worked, and survived. It was an ever-present force, reminding them daily of their vulnerability. Winter did not merely pass through medieval life. It settled in, and it stayed. In medieval winters, Darkness ruled. It was not a gentle darkness, softened by lamps glowing in every room or streets lit by rows of lights. It was a heavy, enclosing darkness that shaped the rhythm of life and pressed in from all sides. When the sun disappeared, the world seemed to pause, waiting quietly for morning that felt impossibly far away, with no artificial lighting beyond firelight, candles, or oil lamps. People lived entirely by the sun. Daylight governed every activity. When the sun rose, work began. When it set, life slowed and then stopped. In winter, this rhythm became harsh and restrictive. Days shortened dramatically, leaving little time for labor, travel, or even basic tasks. In northern regions, daylight sometimes lasted only a few hours. The sun rose late, hovered low in the sky, and disappeared early, casting long shadows even at midday. Often it was hidden behind thick clouds, offering light but little warmth. Snow reflected faint brightness, but skies remained grey and dull. For weeks at a time, the loss of daylight was deeply felt. Tasks that required light spinning, sewing, reading, carving, or repairing tools became difficult or impossible once the sun faded. People rushed to complete essential work before dusk, knowing that once darkness arrived, progress would slow to a crawl. Candles existed, but they were expensive and precious. Made from beeswax or tallow, they required resources that many families could barely spare. Beeswax candles burned cleanly and brightly but were rare and usually reserved for churches or wealthy households. Tallow candles, made from animal fat, were cheaper but smoky, foul-smelling, and inefficient. Most households owned only a few candles, if any at all. These were saved for emergencies, religious observances, or important tasks that could not wait. For daylight, lighting a candle for casual use was considered wasteful. Every inch of wax mattered. Oil lamps were another option, but they required animal fat or vegetable oil, both valuable commodities. Fat could be eaten or preserved for cooking. Oil was difficult to produce and store. Burning either for light meant sacrificing food or future security. As a result, evenings were long, quiet, and dim. Once the sun set, families gathered near the hearth, the only reliable source of light and warmth. Firelight flickered across walls, casting shadows that moved and shifted with every crackle of wood. Faces were partially illuminated, expressions softened by darkness. Conversation slowed. People spoke quietly, conserving energy. Silence was common. Without light, there was little stimulation. No books to read for most people, no games requiring sight, no entertainment beyond storytelling or prayer. Many simply went to bed early, not because they were tired, but because there was nothing else to do. Darkness forced inactivity. The long winter evenings stretched endlessly. Hours passed slowly, marked only by the sound of wind outside or the settling of the fire. Time felt thicker in the dark, as if each moment lingered longer than it should. Children grew restless, but there was little space or energy for play. Adults felt the weight of the day settle into their bodies. Cold crept closer as the fire burned down. One by one, people retreated to bed, wrapped in heavy blankets and wearing layers of clothing. But sleep was not peaceful. Cold interrupted rest constantly. As fires died down overnight, temperatures dropped sharply. Bodies stiffened. Shivering woke people again and again. Even those closest to the hearth felt the chill by morning. Wind rattled walls and doors. Loose boards creaked. Thatch roofs rustled. As snow piled up, sometimes wind forced its way inside, carrying flakes of snow or sharp gusts of icy air. Snow piled against doors, sealing homes shut. Opening them in the morning required effort, sometimes shoveling or pushing from inside. The knowledge that escape was difficult added to the sense of isolation. Hunger gnawed quietly in the dark. For those with limited food, night was the hardest time. Stomachs empty, People lay awake listening to their own bodies. Hunger was not loud, but persistent, a dull ache that refused to be ignored. Thoughts returned again and again to dwindling supplies and uncertain spring harvests outside. The world felt alive in unsettling ways. Wolves howled in the distance, their calls echoing across frozen fields and forests. For people who lived near woodland, these sounds were reminders of danger and vulnerability. Livestock had to be protected. Doors were barred tightly. Branches cracked under the weight of ice, the sharp sound breaking the silence unexpectedly. Trees groaned in the wind. Sometimes the noise sounded like footsteps or voices, feeding superstition and fear. Darkness encouraged imagination, with limited understanding of natural phenomena. Winter nights became fertile ground for superstition. People believed spirits, demons, and restless souls were more active in the cold months. Long nights were thought to invite misfortune. Shadows flickering on walls took on shapes that unsettled tired minds. Religious belief offered some comfort. Prayer marked the passage of time. Monks and nuns rose for nighttime services even in deep winter, walking through freezing corridors to chant in dark chapels. For ordinary people, whispered prayers before sleep were a way to face the night. Winter nights stretched endlessly, broken only by the slow passing of time. There were no clocks in most homes. Time was measured by the fire burning low, by hunger returning, by cold creeping deeper into blankets. Each waking moment felt longer than the last. Night did not end quickly, it lingered. Morning eventually came, but even dawn brought little relief. Light returned slowly, weak and pale. The sun crept above the horizon reluctantly, as if unsure it should appear at all. In medieval winters, darkness was not just the absence of light. It was a condition of life. It shaped behavior, mood, and survival. It demanded patience, endurance, and quiet resilience. And each night endured was another small victory against the season itself. Autumn was the last chance to prepare for winter. As summer faded, urgency filled the air. The days were still long enough to work from dawn until dusk, but everyone knew time was running out. Once frost touched the fields, there would be no second chances. Whatever food had not been gathered, preserved, or stored by then would be lost. Autumn was not simply a season, it was a deadline. Harvests had to be completed before cold destroyed crops. Entire communities moved in rhythm, cutting grain, gathering vegetables, and pulling roots from the earth as quickly as possible. Fields that had sustained families all year were stripped bare in a matter of weeks. The pace was relentless. Hands blistered, backs ached, and fatigue was ignored because failure meant hunger. Grain was the foundation of survival. Wheat, barley, rye, and oats were cut, bundled, and threshed. The kernels were dried carefully to prevent mold. Moisture was the enemy. One poorly dried sack could rot and contaminate others, ruining months of effort. Grain was then stored in sealed containers or lofts, guarded closely against pests and thieves. Vegetables required equal care. Cabbages, turnips, onions, and carrots were harvested and preserved. Some were pickled in brine or vinegar, stored in heavy barrels. Others were buried in root cellars, underground spaces designed to stay cool but not freeze. These cellars were checked constantly, as a single freeze or rot could destroy an entire supply. Meat preservation was perhaps the most critical task of all. Livestock that could not be fed through winter was slaughtered in autumn. Nothing was wasted. Meat was salted heavily or smoked over slow fires. Fat was rendered into lard or tallow. Bones were saved for broth. Hides were cured. Blood was used in sausages or puddings. Every scrap of food mattered. Despite careful planning, supplies rarely lasted comfortably until spring. Medieval preservation methods slowed decay but could not stop it entirely. Mold formed rodents, found their way into storage. Barrels leaked, root vegetables froze or rotted unexpectedly. Losses were inevitable. Fresh food disappeared quickly. By midwinter, diets became repetitive and thin. Meals were no longer about enjoyment, but endurance. Bread became the center of daily eating. Often dark, dense, and coarse. As weeks passed, it grew stale and hard. Older bread was soaked in broth or water to make it chewable. Stews became thinner as ingredients dwindled. What had once been hearty meals filled with vegetables and meat turned into watery mixtures stretched to feed many mouths. Salted meat, though filling, was tough and overly preserved. It provided calories but little nutrition, lacking the vitamins. Lost during preservation. Variety vanished. People ate the same foods day after day. There were no fresh fruits. Greens were rare. Vitamin deficiencies were common, though poorly understood. Weakness, bleeding gums, and fatigue spread silently. Hunger was common. It was not always the sharp pain of starvation, but a constant undercurrent. People felt hungry even after eating. Portions grew smaller. Meals were delayed. Children were given more when possible, adults less. Parents went without to keep their families alive. In poor years, crops failed entirely. Too much rain ruined harvests. Drought reduced yields. Early frost destroyed fields before they could be gathered. When that happened, winter became a slow famine rather than a test of endurance. Food was rationed carefully. Families calculated how long their supplies might last. Eating less became routine. Some skipped meals entirely, especially in late winter when stores ran lowest. Hunger became normalized, something to be endured quietly. Children suffered the most. Growing bodies needed nutrients that winter diets could not provide. Many children grew weak, ill, or died before spring. Those who survived often carried the effects of malnutrition for life. The elderly also suffered greatly. Frail bodies struggled to withstand cold and hunger. Illness took hold easily. Many did not survive harsh winters, especially when food was scarce. In extreme cases, desperation overruled caution. Families ate seed grain meant for planting in spring. This decision offered short-term survival at the cost of future starvation. Once seed was consumed, recovery became difficult or impossible. Some families slaughtered breeding animals, sacrificing long-term stability for immediate relief. Every desperate decision had consequences. Communities attempted to help one another, but charity was limited. Everyone faced the same shortages. Churches distributed alms when possible. Lords sometimes reduced rents or provided grain, but such aid was inconsistent and often insufficient. Winter hunger was quiet and persistent. It did not announce itself loudly. It crept in slowly, weakening bodies over weeks and months. People became more susceptible to illness. Wounds healed slowly. Energy faded. Simple tasks became exhausting. Hunger changed behavior. Tempers shortened. Hope dimmed. Theft increased. Conflicts over food broke out. Trust between neighbors frayed under pressure. Hunger stripped away patience and exposed vulnerability. By late winter, many lived on the edge. Supplies ran dangerously low. People counted days until spring. Some did not make it. Others survived by luck, resilience, or shared resources. When spring finally arrived, it did not immediately end hunger. Fields needed time to produce new food. The gap between winter's end and the first harvest was known as the Hungry Gap, a period of continued scarcity for medieval people. Winter hunger was not an exception. It was a recurring threat woven into the rhythm of life. Each autumn offered a chance to prepare. Each winter tested the limits of those preparations, and each spring brought relief if it came in time. Winter hunger did not always kill quickly. It weakened, drained, and lingered. Quiet enemy, waiting patiently in the cold. Winter created perfect conditions for illness. It did not arrive suddenly, nor did it announce itself with obvious signs. Instead, sickness crept in quietly, moving through homes and communities with the same patience as the cold itself. The medieval winter weakened the body in many small ways, and together, those weaknesses formed an ideal environment for disease to take hold. Cold alone placed enormous strain on the human body. Maintaining warmth required constant energy that many people simply did not have. As temperatures dropped, the body worked harder just to survive, diverting strength away from healing and resistance. Immune systems, already fragile, faltered under the constant pressure of cold exposure. Malnutrition made this worse. Winter diets lacked variety and essential nutrients. Fresh fruits and vegetables disappeared early, leaving people dependent on bread, salted meat, and thin stews. Vitamins were unknowingly lost, and deficiencies weakened the body further. Hunger did not always mean starvation, but it meant the body never fully recovered from fatigue or minor illness. Even those who ate regularly were often undernourished. Damp living conditions encouraged infection. Snow melted into homes, roofs leaked, walls absorbed moisture, clothing rarely dried fully, bedding stayed cold and wet. These conditions allowed respiratory illnesses to thrive. Persistent dampness irritated lungs and skin, creating openings for infection. Homes were crowded, especially in winter. Families slept together to conserve warmth. Animals were sometimes brought indoors, adding dirt, waste, and disease. With little ventilation, smoke from fires lingered in there, irritating lungs already weakened by cold and hunger. Disease spread easily in such close quarters. A single cough could pass quickly from person to person. A fever moved through a household in days. There was little understanding of contagion. Illness was often seen as divine punishment, bad air, or imbalance in bodily fluids, rather than something that could be prevented. Simple illnesses became deadly. What might have been a mild cold in warmer seasons could become fatal in winter. A persistent cough often turned into pneumonia. Chest infections deepened as bodies failed to generate enough heat to fight them. Breathing became painful, labored, and slow. Fevers were particularly dangerous. Without proper care, they could last for weeks. Dehydration followed quickly. As clean water was scarce and often frozen, weakness set in. Hallucinations were common. Many people slipped quietly into death during long winter nights. Without antibiotics or modern medicine, treatment options were limited. Herbal remedies were widely used, passed down through generations. Some offered relief, others did nothing, and some were harmful. Garlic, honey, herbs, and teas were common treatments. Warmth was considered healing, but it was often unavailable. Prayer played a central role. Illness was deeply intertwined with faith. People prayed for recovery, forgiveness, and mercy. Churches filled with candles during outbreaks. Even as cold air crept through stone walls, rest was advised. But rest was a luxury many could not afford. Work continued even when sick. Animals still needed care. Fires still needed tending. Food still needed preparation. For the poor, stopping work meant risking starvation. Doctors were rare, expensive, and often ineffective. Most villages did not have trained physicians. Those who practiced medicine often learned through apprenticeships rather than formal education. Medical knowledge was based on ancient texts and theories of bodily humors. Illness was believed to result from imbalance, not infection. Bloodletting was a common treatment. Patients were bled to restore balance, often weakening them further. Leeches were used. Purging was encouraged. These practices frequently worsened conditions, especially in already malnourished individuals. Most people relied on folk healers or religious guidance. Wise women, herbalists, and midwives treated illness using traditional methods. Some treatments provided comfort or limited relief. Others were rooted in superstition. Amulets, charms, and rituals were common, especially during epidemics, once illness took hold in winter. Recovery was slow. The body lacked everything it needed. To heal, warmth was scarce, energy was depleted, nutrition was inadequate. Even when symptoms faded, weakness lingered. People took weeks or months to regain strength, if they did at all. Relapses were common. A recovered cough returned, fever reappeared. Each episode weakened the body further. Winter allowed no margin for error. Many people did not survive until spring. Death often came quietly. There were no dramatic moments, no sudden collapse. People grew weaker, slept more, spoke less. Families watched helplessly, knowing there was little they could do. Funerals were simple, if they happened at all. Frozen ground made digging graves nearly impossible. Bodies were sometimes stored until thaw, increasing fear and discomfort. Winter cemeteries filled silently, often without markers or ceremonies. Death became familiar. Children learned early that winter took lives. Elders expected it. Communities mourned collectively. Then continued on. Grief was real, but survival demanded endurance. There was little time to dwell. Illness reshaped winter life. Fear spread alongside disease. People avoided travel. Markets slowed. Isolation increased. The sick were sometimes separated, sometimes prayed over, sometimes ignored. Out of fear, winter illness did not discriminate. The poor suffered first, but even the wealthy were vulnerable. Castles were cold and damp. Nobles fell ill despite better food and shelter. Monasteries lost monks and nuns to winter disease. Soldiers guarding walls succumbed to exposure and infection. Every winter carried uncertainty. No one knew who would survive until spring. No one knew if a mild cough would turn fatal. No one knew when death might arrive. Winter was not only cold, it was fragile. A season where the human body existed at its limits. A season where illness waited patiently. A season where survival was never guaranteed. And when spring finally came, it brought not just warmth, but the quiet relief of having lived through another winter's silent war. Winter created perfect conditions for illness. It did not arrive suddenly, nor did it announce itself with obvious signs. Instead, sickness crept in quietly, moving through homes and communities with the same patience as the cold itself. The medieval winter weakens the body in many small ways, and together, those weaknesses formed an ideal environment for disease to take hold. Cold alone placed enormous strain on the human body. Maintaining warmth required constant energy that many people simply did not have. As temperatures dropped, the body worked harder just to survive, diverting strength away from healing and resistance. Immune systems, already fragile, faltered under the constant pressure of cold exposure. Malnutrition made this worse. Winter diets lacked variety and essential nutrients. Fresh fruits and vegetables disappeared early, leaving people dependent on bread, salted meat, and thin stews. Vitamins were unknowingly lost, and deficiencies weakened the body further. Hunger did not always mean starvation, but it meant the body never fully recovered from fatigue or minor illness. Even those who ate regularly were often undernourished. Damp living conditions encouraged infection. Snow melted into homes, roofs leaked, walls absorbed moisture, clothing rarely dried fully, bedding stayed cold and wet. These conditions allowed respiratory illnesses to thrive. Persistent dampness irritated lungs and skin, creating openings for infection. Homes were crowded, especially in winter. Families slept together to conserve warmth. Animals were sometimes brought indoors, adding dirt, waste, and disease. With little ventilation, smoke from fires lingered in there, irritating lungs already weakened by cold and hunger. disease spread easily in such close quarters. A single cough could pass quickly from person to person. A fever moved through a household in days. There was little understanding of contagion. Illness was often seen as divine punishment, bad air, or imbalance in bodily fluids rather than something that could be prevented. Simple illnesses became deadly. What might have been a mild cold in warmer seasons could become fatal in winter. A persistent cough often turned into pneumonia. Chest infections deepened as bodies failed to generate enough heat to fight them. Breathing became painful, labored, and slow. Fevers were particularly dangerous. Without proper care, they could last for weeks. Dehydration followed quickly. As clean water was scarce and often frozen, weakness set in. Hallucinations were common. Many people slipped quietly into death during long winter nights. Without antibiotics or modern medicine, treatment options were limited. Herbal remedies were widely used, passed down through generations. Some offered relief, others did nothing, and some were harmful. Garlic, honey, herbs, and teas were common treatments. Warmth was considered healing, but it was often unavailable. Prayer played a central role. Illness was deeply intertwined with faith. People prayed for recovery, forgiveness, and mercy. Churches filled with candles during outbreaks. Even as cold air crept through stone walls, rest was advised. But rest was a luxury many could not afford. Work continued even when sick. Animals still needed care. Fires still needed tending. Food still needed preparation. For the poor, stopping work meant risking starvation. Doctors were rare, expensive, and often ineffective. Most villages did not have trained physicians. Those who practiced medicine often learned through apprenticeships rather than formal education. Medical knowledge was based on ancient texts and theories of bodily humors. Illness was believed to result from imbalance, not infection. Bloodletting was a common treatment. Patients were bled to restore balance, often weakening them further. Leeches were used. Purging was encouraged. These practices frequently worsened conditions, especially in already malnourished individuals. Most people relied on folk healers or religious guidance. Wise women, herbalists, and midwives treated illness using traditional methods. Some treatments provided comfort or limited relief. Others were rooted in superstition. Amulets, charms, and rituals were common, especially during epidemics. Once illness took hold in winter, recovery was slow. The body lacked everything it needed to heal. Warmth was scarce, energy was depleted, nutrition was inadequate. Even when symptoms faded, weakness lingered. People took weeks or months to regain strength, if they did at all. Relapses were common. A recovered cough returned. Fever reappeared. Each episode weakened the body further. Winter allowed no margin for error. Many people did not survive until spring. Death often came quietly. There were no dramatic moments, no sudden collapse. People grew weaker, slept more, spoke less. Families watched helplessly, knowing there was little they could do. Funerals were simple, if they happened at all. Frozen ground made digging graves nearly impossible. Bodies were sometimes stored until thaw, increasing fear and discomfort. Winter cemeteries filled silently, often without markers or ceremonies. Death became familiar. Children learned early that winter took lives. Elders expected it. Communities mourned collectively. Then continued on. Grief was real, but survival demanded endurance. There was little time to dwell. Illness reshaped winter life. Fear spread alongside disease. People avoided travel. Markets slowed. Isolation increased. The sick were sometimes separated, sometimes prayed over, sometimes ignored. Out of fear, winter illness did not discriminate. The poor suffered first, but even the wealthy were vulnerable. Castles were cold and damp. Nobles fell ill despite better food and shelter. Monasteries lost monks and nuns to winter disease. Soldiers guarding walls succumbed to exposure and infection. Every winter carried uncertainty. No one knew who would survive until spring. No one knew if a mild cough would turn fatal. No one knew when death might arrive. Winter was not only cold, it was fragile, a season where the human body existed at its limits. A season where illness waited patiently, a season where survival was never guaranteed, and when spring finally came, it brought not just warmth, but the quiet relief of having lived through another winter's silent war. Fire was life in medieval winter. Without fire, there was no warmth, no cooked food, no light, and little hope of survival in a season defined by cold and darkness. Fire stood at the center of daily existence. It was not a comfort or a luxury, it was a necessity. As fundamental as food or shelter, the hearth was the heart of the medieval home, and its flame determined whether a family endured the winter or succumbed to it. Wood was the primary fuel across most of medieval Europe. Forests supplied branches, logs, and kindling, but gathering them was neither easy nor safe. Fuel had to be collected months in advance, during late summer and autumn, before snow made paths impassable and before cold weakened the body. Men, women, and children all participated, carrying heavy loads of wood over long distances. Axes were crude, saws inefficient, and injuries common. In regions where wood was scarce, people relied on alternatives. Peat was cut from bogs and dried into bricks, a slow and exhausting process. Dung, especially from cattle, was collected, shaped, and dried for burning. In some areas, coal was available, but it was difficult to extract and unpleasant to burn indoors due to smoke and fumes. Each fuel source had drawbacks, but any heat was better than none. Fuel collection was dangerous work. Autumn weather was unpredictable. Early frosts numbed fingers and slowed movement. Slippery ground caused falls. Long hours outdoors exhausted the body before winter had even begun, yet stopping early was not an option. Every log not gathered was a future hour of gold. Once winter arrived, fuel became precious. Running out of firewood was catastrophic. Without fire, homes became unlivable. Food could not be cooked. Water froze solid. Illness spread quickly. In extreme cold, survival without fire was nearly impossible. Families feared empty woodpiles as much as empty grain stores. To prevent this, firewood was rationed carefully. Fires were kept small. Sometimes little more than glowing embers. Flames were discouraged unless absolutely necessary. Every log burned was a calculation. Warmth now versus survival later. Often, families allowed the fire to die overnight. Nighttime was the coldest part of the day. But burning fuel while sleeping was considered wasteful and risky. Fires were banked low or extinguished completely. Mornings were brutally cold. Breath fogged the air. Fingers stiffened immediately. Faces ached from exposure. Restarting a fire was not guaranteed. If embers from the night before had been carefully preserved under ash, the fire could be coaxed back to life. If not, families had to borrow fire from neighbors, carrying a glowing coal in a covered container through snow and wind. This practice created dependence between households. Those without neighbors or those whose neighbors were also struggling faced desperate situations. Fireplaces themselves were inefficient. Most medieval hearths were open fires with no chimney, or poorly designed flues, smoke-filled rooms, stinging eyes and lungs, soot-coated walls and ceilings. Heat escaped quickly upward, leaving much of the room cold. Only those sitting directly beside the fire felt its warmth. Heat rarely spread evenly. One side of the body might feel scorched while the other froze. Feet remained cold, pressed against icy floors. People shifted positions constantly, rotating places near the hearth to share warmth. Arguments broke out over who deserved the warmest spot. Rooms beyond the hearth were often unheated entirely, sleeping areas were cold, storage rooms froze. Latrines became unbearable to use, indoor movement was minimized to conserve body heat. Life shrank inward, centering around the fire. To survive, people adapted their behavior and expectations. They slept fully clothed, wearing multiple layers of wool and linen. Hats were worn indoors and even in bed, as much heat was lost through. The head cloaks doubled as blankets. Bedding was thick, but rarely clean or dried blankets were shared. Beds were crowded with family members sleeping close together. Children were placed between adults. Privacy disappeared in winter, replaced by necessity. The warmth of bodies was often the most reliable heat source available. Animals were sometimes brought indoors. Chickens, goats, pigs, and even cows were housed in the same space as people, especially during severe cold. Their body heat helped warm the room, but they also brought filth, smell, and disease. Still, the benefit outweighed the discomfort. Warmth mattered more than cleanliness. Winter demanded closeness not by choice, but necessity. This closeness reshaped relationships. Families spent long hours together in silence or quiet conversation. Tensions rose easily. Tempers shortened. There was no escape from one another or from the cold pressing in from all sides. Fire also meant light. In a world without electricity, the hearth provided illumination after sunset. Shadows flickered across walls. Faces glowed briefly, then disappeared. Again, this light allowed limited work, mending clothes, preparing food, but strained eyes and slowed productivity. Fire was essential for cooking. Winter meals relied on the hearth. Bread was baked near it. Stews simmered slowly, stretched to feed many mouths. Cooking took longer in cold weather, consuming more fuel. Families balanced the need to cook against the need to stay warm. Fire affected health. Smoke inhalation damaged lungs, especially in enclosed spaces. Many suffered chronic coughing and breathing problems. Yet opening windows to vent smoke meant letting in cold air, so smoke was tolerated. Fire also carried risk. Homes built from wood and thatch were highly flammable. Sparks escaped hearths easily. A single mistake could destroy an entire home or village. Winter fires were feared as much as winter cold. Families watched flames carefully, especially when exhausted. Despite its dangers, fire was protection. It warded off cold, cooked food, dried clothes, and offered psychological comfort. The sight of flame reassured people that they were still holding back winter's worst effects. When fuel ran low, fear grew. People counted remaining logs. They argued over usage. They planned for emergencies. Some stole wood from forests or neighbors. Punishments for illegal wood gathering were harsh, but desperation overruled law. Communities developed customs around fire. Neighbors shared embers. Villagers gathered in communal halls where larger fires burned. Churches provided warmth during services. Fire became a shared resource as well as a personal one. For the poorest, fire was often insufficient. They burned scraps, broken furniture, or dried plants. Their fires were weak and short-lived. Many froze slowly, especially during long cold spells. For the wealthy, fire was abundant but imperfect. Large halls required enormous amounts of fuel to heat, yet still felt cold. Servants spent entire days feeding fires. Even nobles complained of winter discomfort. Fire did not conquer winter. It held it at bay. Temporarily and imperfectly, flames flickered and faded. Ashes cooled. Cold always returned, yet without fire survival would have been impossible. Fire was not warmth, it was resistance. Not comfort but endurance. Not luxury but life itself. In medieval winter, the flame in the hearth was more than burning wood. It was hope, fragile and flickering, held carefully against the dark and the cold. Despite cold and darkness, work continued. Winter did not grant permission to stop. It did not pause obligations or soften expectations. Life slowed, but it never rested. Even as snow covered the ground and daylight vanished, the medieval world continued to function through sheer necessity. Survival depended on work, and winter demanded it in quieter, harsher ways. Animals required constant care. Livestock were valuable, often more valuable than people. Cows, sheep, goats, pigs, and chickens represented food, income, and future security. Losing an animal to winter meant losing milk, meat, wool, or labor, even when fodder was scarce. Animals had to be fed. Hay stored during summer was rationed carefully. Just like food for humans, watering animals was one of the most difficult winter tasks. Streams froze solid, wells iced over, buckets left outdoors turned into blocks of ice. Every morning, ice had to be broken by hand, often with crude tools. Fingers numbed quickly, splashes soaked clothing, which then froze still. The work had to be done. Animals could not survive without water. Protection from freezing temperatures was equally important. Animals were moved into barns or shelters, sometimes into human living spaces. Stalls were insulated with straw. Doors were reinforced. Drafts were blocked. Despite these efforts, many animals fell ill or died during harsh winters, victims of cold, disease, or hunger. Manure had to be cleared daily, even in winter. Waste accumulated quickly in enclosed spaces, allowing it to build up. Risk disease and injury. Clearing manure meant exposure to cold, wet conditions and foul air. It was unpleasant, exhausting work, but unavoidable. Field labor disappeared under snow, but work did not end. It moved indoors. Long winter hours were filled with tasks that had been postponed during growing seasons. Wool was spun into yarn. Yarn was woven into cloth. Clothing was mended repeatedly, patched and repatched until it barely resembled its original form. Nothing was thrown away if it could be repaired. These tasks were done by firelight or weak daylight filtering through small openings, eyes strained constantly, threads blurred. Hands stiffened from cold, making fine movements difficult. Mistakes were common, but starting over cost time and energy. Tool repair became essential. Farm tools dulled during harvest had to be sharpened. Wooden handles cracked from dryness and cold. Metal rusted in damp air. Repairs were done slowly, often imperfectly, using limited materials. A broken tool in spring could mean disaster, so winter preparation mattered. Food preparation continued endlessly. Grain had to be ground into flour using hand mills. This was labor-intensive and physically demanding. Meat had to be checked regularly. For spoilage, barrels were inspected, mold scraped away. Pickled vegetables were monitored closely. One missed sign of rot could ruin weeks of food. Cooking itself required effort. Fires had to be lit, maintained, and fed. Cooking took longer in cold conditions. Pots heated slowly. Water took longer to boil. Every meal required planning, coordination, and fuel. For peasants, obligations to lords remained unchanged. Winter did not suspend feudal duties. Rent still had to be paid, often in grain or labor. Some peasants were required to perform winter tasks for their lord, repairing buildings, clearing paths, tending animals, or working in workshops. Failure to meet expectations could result in punishment. Excuses based on cold or illness were rarely accepted. Lords relied on peasant labor year-round. Missing a duty could lead to fines, loss of land, or physical punishment. Fear of authority added to winter stress. Even church obligations continued. Attendance at services was expected, regardless of weather. Walking long distances through snow to unheated churches was common. Standing for hours during services while cold seeped into bones was endured silently. Travel became dangerous. Snow-covered roads disappeared entirely. Landmarks vanished beneath white fields. Paths became indistinguishable from ditches or frozen. Streams travelers relied on memory, instinct, and luck. Getting lost was easy. Getting found was rare. Rivers posed unpredictable threats. Some froze solid, allowing passage until they didn't. Thin ice broke without warning. Flooding occurred when ice dams collapsed. Drownings were common. Bridges were scarce and often damaged by winter storms. Wagons could not move easily. Wheels broke on frozen ground. Horses slipped and injured themselves. Goods that normally traveled between towns stayed where they were. Trade slowed dramatically. Markets shrank. Prices rose. Messages traveled slowly, if at all. Letters were delayed. News arrived late. Sometimes it never arrived. Communities became isolated, unaware of events beyond their immediate surroundings. This isolation increased fear and uncertainty. Help was rarely available when needed most. Winter narrowed the world. People's lives contracted to a few familiar spaces: the home, the barn, the church, and nearby neighbors. Long journeys were avoided. Social interactions declined. The outside world faded into rumor and memory. Time felt different. Without long days or varied activities, days blended together. Work repeated endlessly. The same tasks, the same routines, the same cold. Progress was measured not by achievement, but by endurance. Work itself became heavier in winter. Cold stiffened muscles. Hunger drained strength. Illness slowed movement. Simple tasks required more effort than in warmer months. Fatigue set in earlier and lingered longer. There was little rest, even when work paused. The body remained tense, guarding against cold. Sleep was shallow. Waking brought immediate labor. Winter offered no true downtime, only survival mode. Women's labor increased significantly. In addition to household tasks, women cared for children, the sick, and the elderly. They managed food distribution, ensuring supplies lasted as long as possible. Emotional labor, maintaining hope, calm, and routine fell heavily on them. Children worked too. They carried wood, helped feed animals, spun wool, and ran errands through snow. Childhood in winter was not protected or sheltered. It was shaped by responsibility and exposure. Despite everything, work continued because it had to. Stopping meant freezing. Stopping meant hunger. Stopping meant death. Winter did not eliminate labor, it refined it, slowed it, and made it harsher. Every task mattered more. Every effort carried higher stakes. The medieval world did not conquer winter. It endured it day by day, task by task. And as weeks passed, people counted not achievements, but survival. Another animal fed. Another fire lit. Another day endured. Winter narrowed the world, but within that narrow space, life persisted quietly, stubbornly, and without pause. Winter weighed heavily on the mind. It pressed inward as much as it pressed down. While the cold attacked the body, winter also worked quietly on thoughts, emotions, and morale. Long before psychology had names for depression or anxiety, medieval people lived with their effects, especially during the dark months. Winter did not only challenge survival, it challenged resilience. Isolation increased as the season deepened. Communities that felt lively in warmer months grew silent. Roads disappeared beneath snow and ice. Travelers stopped passing through. Markets shrank or closed entirely. The familiar rhythm of outside contact faded, replaced by long stretches of sameness. Villages became inward-looking. Neighbors saw only those closest by. Even short journeys felt risky. Visiting distant relatives or nearby towns required effort, planning, and luck. Many chose to stay home unless absolutely necessary. Over time, the world seemed to shrink. News arrived late or not at all. Messages carried by travelers or messengers were delayed for weeks. Important events, wars, famines, deaths. Births might remain unknown until spring. This lack of information created uncertainty and fear. People imagined the worst, often without evidence. Being cut off from the outside world altered perception. Without new stimuli, the mind turned inward. Thoughts repeated, worries grew louder, the same concerns returned night after night. Food supplies, illness, cold, survival, there were few distractions. Fear grew in the dark. Long winter nights encouraged imagination. Firelight cast shifting shadows on walls, transforming ordinary shapes into unsettling forms. Sounds carried farther in cold air. A creaking beam or snapping branch could trigger alarm. Superstitions thrived. Medieval belief systems were deeply intertwined with nature and unseen. Winter, with its darkness and silence, was believed to be a time when spirits moved freely. People spoke of demons, restless souls, and curses becoming more powerful during cold months. Night was considered especially dangerous. Children were warned not to wander after dark. Adults avoided travel at night unless necessary. Darkness was associated with temptation, evil, and divine testing. Winter magnified these fears. Stories circulated in whispers, tales of wandering spirits, frozen corpses returning to life, wolves possessed by evil, and omens in the sky passed from person to person. With little external information, these stories filled the void left by isolation. Long darkness encouraged anxiety. Without daylight to regulate sleep and activity, rhythms broke down. People slept more but rested less. Insomnia was common. Waking during the night brought immediate awareness of cold, hunger, and fear. Depression was common, though unnamed. People did not speak of mental health, but they experienced its weight. Days felt repetitive and empty. Tasks blended together. There was little to look forward to beyond. Survival. The future felt uncertain, especially as food supplies dwindled. Hope faded slowly. At the start of winter, optimism still existed. There were plans, routines, and preparation. But as weeks passed, optimism gave way to endurance. People stopped thinking in terms of months and began thinking in terms of days. Many feared they would not survive until spring. This fear was not irrational. They had seen winters claim lives before. They had buried neighbors, friends, and family members after harsh seasons. Each cough, each missed meal, each freezing night carried the question, will this be the one? The mind became preoccupied with calculation. How long would food last? How many logs remained? How many mouths needed feeding? How much strength remained? These thoughts returned endlessly, especially at night. Winter also intensified grief. Deaths that occurred in winter felt heavier. Funerals were often delayed or minimal due to frozen ground. Mourning was incomplete. Loss lingered without closure. People carried grief alongside daily labor. Isolation made grief quieter, but deeper. There were fewer gatherings, fewer distractions, fewer opportunities to share sorrow. Silence amplified sadness. People mourned privately, often in the dark. Faith offered comfort. Religion played a central role in medieval life, especially during hardship. Prayer structured days and nights. Churches offered a sense of order and meaning. Suffering was framed as a test, a punishment, or a path to salvation. Prayer gave people something to do with their fear. It offered language for hope, even when circumstances felt hopeless. Rituals marked time when days blurred together. The church calendar provided structure, reminding people that winter, too, would pass, but faith had limits. Prayer could not warm cold bones. It could not fill empty stomachs. It could not cure illness or stop hunger. When suffering continued despite devotion, doubt crept in. Some questioned quietly, why did God allow such hardship? Why did the faithful suffer alongside the sinful? Why did winter return year after year? These questions were rarely spoken aloud, but they existed. Winter tested endurance not just physically but mentally. The constant strain wore down patience. Small frustrations felt overwhelming. Arguments rose easily. Tensions within families grew as privacy disappeared and stress increased. Parents worried constantly. They watched children grow thinner. They measured food carefully. They balanced honesty with reassurance. Keeping fear hidden became another form of labor. Children sensed anxiety even when it was unspoken. They learned early to read adults' expressions, to recognize when supplies ran low or illness spread. Winter shaped their emotional world as much as their physical one. Loneliness became a quiet companion. Even in crowded homes, people felt alone, without external contact, without new experiences. Minds turned inward, memories resurfaced, regrets grew louder, time seemed slower. The psychological weight of winter compounded physical hardship. Cold weakened bodies, hunger drained energy, illness threatened life, darkness magnified fear, isolation deepened despair. Together, these forces created a mental landscape defined by endurance rather than comfort, yet people endured. They told stories by firelight. They prayed together. They found small routines that gave shape to days. They held onto the promise of spring, even when it felt distant. Winter did not break everyone, but it tested everyone. It revealed resilience, patience, and quiet strength. It forced people to confront uncertainty and fear with limited resources. When spring finally arrived, relief was not only physical. Light returned, movement resumed. Hope reawakened. Surviving winter meant more than living through cold. It meant preserving the mind through darkness, fear, and isolation. And for those who endured, each spring was not just a season but a victory over winter's invisible weight. Not everyone faced winter equally. While cold, hunger, and darkness touched every corner of medieval society, the weight of winter fell unevenly. Status, wealth, age, and circumstance shaped how people experienced the season, but none were fully spared. Winter exposed inequality clearly, revealing who had reserves and who lived on the edge of survival. Even in good years, the poor suffered first. For peasants and laborers with little or no surplus, winter began long before the first snowfall. Their autumn preparations were limited by what they could afford, what land they could access, and how much they could store. Many lived harvest to harvest, with little margin for loss. When winter arrived, their supplies were already thin. Without extra food or fuel, hunger came early. Meals were reduced quickly. Fires were kept small or extinguished altogether. People wore the same worn clothing day after day. Despite its inability to keep out the cold, shoes broke, cloaks thinned. Repairs were made repeatedly, until nothing remained to fix. Orphans were especially vulnerable. Without parents to provide food or shelter, orphaned children depended on relatives, neighbors, or religious institutions. In winter, charity was strained. Communities had less to give. Many orphans were sent to work early, exposed to cold and hunger long before their bodies were ready. Others simply disappeared from records, lost to illness or starvation. Widows faced similar hardship. Without a husband's labor or income, many women struggled to maintain households. Legal and social barriers limited their options. Some relied on seasonal work that disappeared in winter. Others depended on charity or informal arrangements that offered little security. Cold and hunger pressed hardest on those already marginalized. The elderly suffered quietly. Aging bodies tolerated cold poorly. Hunger weakened them faster. Illness took hold easily. Many elders became dependent on family members who were themselves struggling. When resources ran low, The elderly often ate less so others could survive. Winter deaths among the old were common and rarely questioned. Homeless individuals rarely survived winter. Those without shelter faced near certain death in prolonged cold, sleeping outdoors, in doorways, or in makeshift shelters offered little protection from freezing temperatures. Without fire, warm clothing, or regular food, survival was a matter of luck. Winter acted as a ruthless filter, removing the most vulnerable from society with quiet efficiency. Even among the housed poor, survival was uncertain. A single illness, injury, or failed harvest could push a family past the point of recovery. Winter exposed how fragile life was when built on minimal resources, yet even wealth did not guarantee comfort. Nobles faced winter differently, but not easily. Castles were symbols of power, strength, and security, but they were not warm. Built of thick stone, they blocked wind, but trapped damp cold inside. Once winter settled into castle walls, it lingered for months. Corridors felt icy even near fires. Drafts moved freely through arrow slits, stairwells, and poorly sealed doors. Large fires burned constantly in great halls, but heat rarely travelled far. The sheer size of noble residences made warming them nearly impossible. Servants fed fires day and night, yet rooms remained cold. Smoke filled the air. Stone floors froze feet. Tapestries were hung not only for decoration, but to block drafts and add insulation. Luxury did not guarantee comfort. Nobles owned fine clothing and furs, but even these could not fully counteract winter cold. Heavy garments restricted movement. Jewelry chilled against skin. Bedding was thick, but rooms remained frigid. Sleeping quarters were often separated, limiting the shared warmth that poorer families relied upon. Food was plentiful, but not always nourishing. Winter feasts existed, but even noble diets lacked fresh produce. Preservation affected everyone. Illness spread through courts as easily as through villages. Crowded halls and shared spaces encouraged disease. Isolation affected nobles as well. Travel between estates slowed or stopped entirely. Political business was delayed. News arrived late. Winter forced even powerful figures into waiting. Religious communities faced their own trials. Monks and nuns lived in stone monasteries that echoed with cold. Religious devotion demanded discipline regardless of season. Rising before dawn for prayer meant walking through freezing corridors into unheated chapels. Breath fogged here as chants echoed off stone walls. Their clothing was simple. Religious vows discouraged comfort. Woolen habits offered limited warmth. Sleeping quarters were austere. Fires were controlled carefully, often reserved for communal spaces. Individual warmth was considered a luxury, sometimes even a moral failing. Fasting continued in winter. Religious calendars dictated periods of reduced eating, even when hunger was already widespread. For some, faith provided strength. For others, it deepened suffering. Soldiers endured winter in silence. Those guarding city walls, castles, or borders faced constant exposure. Armor was cold and heavy. Metal froze against skin. Snowstorms reduced visibility. Watches stretched endlessly through long nights. Fires were limited to avoid detection or conserve fuel. Winter campaigns were rare but brutal. When war continued through winter, soldiers suffered immensely. Supplies were difficult to transport. Camps were exposed. Disease spread rapidly. Many armies lost more men to winter than to battle. Servants and laborers supporting the elite also bore heavy burdens. Castle staff worked continuously to maintain fires, prepare food, clear snow, and tend animals. Their labor increased in winter, even as conditions worsened. Though they lived indoors, their exposure to cold, smoke, and exhaustion was constant. Winter spared no one completely. Children of nobles fell ill. Peasants showed resilience. monks doubted, soldiers froze. Each group faced different hardships, but all lived under winter's authority. The difference lay not in whether winter hurt but in how much margin for survival existed. The wealthy had reserves, the poor had endurance, some had neither. Winter revealed social structures clearly. It showed who had access to food, fuel, and shelter and who did not. It exposed the limits of charity and the fragility of power. It reminded everyone, regardless of status, that nature ultimately dictated terms, and yet, winter also created moments of shared humanity. Communities gathered when possible. Nobles distributed alms, monasteries opened doors, neighbors shared embers and food. These acts did not eliminate suffering, but they softened it. Winter was not equal, but it was universal. It tested kings and beggars alike. It humbled wealth and punished poverty. It demanded endurance from all who lived within its reach. In medieval life, winter was not a backdrop, it was a reckoning. Some winters were worse than others. Most medieval people expected hardship during the cold months, but certain winters went far beyond endurance. These were not merely difficult seasons, they were disasters that reshaped regions, erased communities, and lodged themselves permanently in memory. Long after the cold had passed, people spoke of these winters in hushed tones, measuring time not by years, but by whether life came before or after them. Extreme cold transformed the landscape itself. Rivers that normally flowed through villages and fields froze solid, becoming wide roads of ice. At first, this seemed useful. People crossed where boats once traveled, but the danger was constant. Ice cracked without warning, floods followed sudden thaws, destroying homes and stored food. Wells froze, mills stopped turning, water, the most basic necessity, became unreliable. Snow fell heavily and repeatedly, piling higher with each storm. Paths vanished, fields disappeared under white emptiness, familiar landmarks were lost, and travelers wandered into ditches, forests, or frozen rivers, never to return. The world became disorienting, as if erased and rewritten by cold. Crops failed entirely. In some years, early frosts struck before harvests were completed. Grain withered in the fields. Vegetables froze in the ground. Seed crops were lost before they could be stored. Even the most prepared households suddenly faced empty barns and cellars. Other winters followed summers of drought or flooding, compounding disaster. Poor harvests left little margin for winter survival. When winter arrived early or lingered too long, starvation followed inevitably. Livestock died in large numbers. Animals froze in open fields or starved when fodder ran out. Barn roofs collapsed under heavy snow. Disease spread rapidly among weakened herds. Horses, essential for transport and farming, perished, crippling entire communities. Even after winter ended, the loss of livestock was devastating. Animals were not just food, they were labor, wealth, and future survival. A family that lost its animals lost its ability to recover. Fields went unplowed, milk vanished, wool disappeared. Even when spring came, the damage endured. Starvation spread across regions. Hunger rarely struck suddenly. It crept in slowly, tightening its grip over months. People rationed food carefully at first, convinced supplies might last. But as winter dragged on, hope faded, portions shrank. Meals were skipped, bodies weakened. Entire regions experienced famine. Grain prices soared beyond reach. Markets emptied, trade collapsed as transport failed. Lords hoarded supplies. Peasants begged, stole, or fled. Cities swelled with desperate refugees seeking food that did not exist. Disease followed hunger closely. Malnourished bodies succumbed easily to illness. Fevers spread rapidly. Entire households fell sick at once. The dead accumulated faster than they could be buried. Frozen ground delayed funerals. Bodies were stored in sheds, churches, or left where they fell. Historical records describe winters that defied belief. Chroniclers wrote of rivers frozen so hard that loaded wagons crossed them. They described wine freezing in barrels and bread turning solid as stone. Birds were said to freeze mid-flight and fall from the sky. Fish trapped beneath ice died in massive numbers, cutting off another food source. Whether exaggerated or not, these accounts reflect genuine terror. People had never experienced cold like this before. They had no frame of reference, no preparation. Seemed enough. Fires burned constantly but failed to warm. Even those with supplies suffered. Entire villages disappeared. Some were abandoned as people fled in search of food. Others died out completely, their inhabitants succumbing to hunger, cold, or disease. Houses collapsed under snow or fell into ruin, never rebuilt. Fields reverted to wilderness. Roads led nowhere. Maps changed quietly. What had once been thriving? Settlements vanished from records. Names survived only in stories. If at all, these disappearances haunted survivors, reminders of how fragile life was in the face of extreme winter. Cannibalism was whispered about during the worst famines. Such acts were rarely recorded openly, but rumors circulated. Desperation drove people beyond moral boundaries. Parents made unthinkable choices. Corpses were consumed. Travelers vanished. These stories carried deep shame and fear, reinforcing the horror of such winters. Even hearing these rumors left lasting scars. Communities that survived such extremes carried collective trauma. Trust eroded. Fear lingered. Memories were passed down, often softened or obscured, but never forgotten. These winters became legends. They were named and remembered. People spoke of the Great Frost, the long winter, the year without bread. Songs, prayers, and sermons referenced them. They became cautionary tales and spiritual lessons, reminders of divine power or human fragility. Surviving them was a mark of strength, luck, or divine favor. Those who lived through such winters were changed. Their bodies bore the marks: stunted growth, chronic illness, missing fingers or toes, lost to frostbite. Their minds carried memories that returned every winter. No matter how mild, survival altered behavior. People who endured extreme winters prepared obsessively in later years. They hoarded food. They gathered more fuel than needed. They feared early frosts and long nights more than others. Winter never became routine again. Faith deepened or fractured. Some survivors credited God with their survival. They prayed more fervently, attended church regularly, and gave thanks each spring. Others struggled with doubt, questioning why some lived while others died. These winters intensified spiritual reflection, shaping belief for generations. Political and social consequences followed. Famine weakened feudal systems. Lords lost tenants. Labor shortages increased peasant bargaining power in some regions. Revolts followed extreme hardship. Governments introduced grain controls or relief measures, sometimes too late. Winter disasters reshaped history quietly. They influenced migration patterns, land ownership, and population distribution. Some regions never recovered fully. Others rebuilt slowly, changed by loss. Memory preserved what records could not. Even centuries later, people told stories of winters that nearly ended everything. They warned children. They referenced them during cold spells. These stories served as reminders of vulnerability and resilience. Extreme winters stripped life to its essentials. Warmth, food, shelter, hope. Everything else fell away. In those years, survival was not guaranteed by wealth, strength, or preparation alone. Chance played a role. So did community. So did timing. Those who survived did so through a combination of endurance, sacrifice, and circumstance. Some shared food. Some fled early. Some were sheltered by others. Some simply endured longer than expected. The dead were mourned briefly. Then Remembered always, these winters were not forgotten because they were cold but because they were transformative. They taught medieval societies the limits of control. They revealed how thin the line was between order and collapse. They reminded people that nature could overwhelm even the strongest structures. And when spring finally arrived after such winters, it was not celebrated lightly. Fields were empty, villages were quiet. Survivors counted losses before blessings. Spring was relief, but also grief. In the medieval world, some winters did more than pass through history. They carved themselves into it. And those who lived through them carried the memory for the rest of their lives, knowing they had survived something few ever could, a winter that almost erased everything. As you lie here, safe and warm, remember the strength of those who came before you. In the darkness of winter, where the cold seems to wrap itself around your very soul, take a moment to reflect on those who faced this same season, but with none of the comforts you now take for granted. Their winters were long, their hardships many, yet they endured day after day. They faced the relentless assault of frost, wind, and hunger. They did not have modern conveniences, nor did they know the certainty of a warm home, full stomachs, or the luxury of readily available medicine. For them, the passing of winter was not just about surviving the cold, it was about proving their resilience. Their winters were battles fought not only against the elements, but against the limitations of their time. Their days were filled with hard labor just to stay alive, and their nights stretched on, long and cold, without the warmth of a furnace or the light of a modern bulb. Every task was harder, every decision more critical. Theirs was a life defined by the harshest conditions. And yet they pressed on. Through cold, hunger, and darkness, they carried on. They did not know when or if the warmth of spring would ever return, but they moved forward, trusting that it would, trusting that after the darkest nights, the light would eventually break through. With each day, they made their way, step by step, through an existence shaped by survival and endurance, never giving up on the hope that, eventually, the season would end. And with each passing season, they shaped the world you now live in. They laid the foundation for the comfort and safety you now enjoy today. Their sacrifices, their struggles, and their quiet determination allowed the generations that followed to build upon their hard-won lessons. They taught their children how to endure, how to survive, and how to rebuild when everything seemed lost. It is easy, in the comfort of a warm bed, surrounded by warmth, light, and modern technology, to forget the struggle that came before. We forget the cold nights, the scarcity of food, the constant battle against the elements. We forget how vulnerable we are in the face of nature's unyielding power, and how quickly everything can be taken away. But the people of the past never had that luxury. They understood the fragility of life, and yet they continued to live it, one harsh season after another. You may never face a winter as harsh as theirs, but their quiet resilience remains a lesson, one of patience, endurance, and the power of hope, even in the darkest of times. Their lives remind us that no matter how difficult our circumstances may seem, we can persevere, we can survive, we can endure, and we can rise again, stronger than before, in the face of adversity. We are often given only two choices: to crumble under the weight of the challenge, or to stand tall, knowing that the storm will pass, and we will be there when it does. The people of the past chose to stand tall. They chose to endure. They chose to trust in the eventual return of spring, even when the world around them seemed hopeless. They understood that the strength to survive did not come from avoiding hardship, but from meeting it head-on and continuing, no matter the cost. So, as the fire burns low and the night wraps its gentle silence around you, rest easy, knowing that the winter of today is nothing like the winters of the past. You are no longer surrounded by the unrelenting cold of medieval winters, no longer fighting to keep yourself warm with nothing more than a few logs and the thin walls of a drafty cottage. Your world is different now. Your home is safe. Your food is abundant. And you are surrounded by warmth and comfort. The technology that has been built over centuries has brought you a level of comfort that the people of the past could only dream of. But remember that this comfort is not guaranteed. It is the result of generations of hard work, struggle, and sacrifice. It is a gift that has been passed down through the ages. And it is one that we must appreciate and protect. The people of the past gave us this world, and we must carry their legacy forward. When you wake in the morning, it will bring not just warmth, but a new day full of possibilities. The possibilities you have today are unimaginable to those who lived through the long winters of the past. They dreamed of a world where they could rest without fear of hunger or the cold, where they could be assured that the days ahead would bring comfort and safety. You live in that world. You live in a time of great opportunity. Every new day is a chance to shape the future. You have the ability to create, to innovate, and to make the world a better place for those who come after you. The struggles of the past may seem distant, but they are never far from our hearts. They remind us that we have a responsibility to those who will inherit this world from us. We must be good stewards of the gifts we have been given, and we must ensure that future generations are just as blessed with comfort, safety, and opportunity as we are. It is easy to become complacent in times of peace and prosperity. It is easy to forget the struggles that came before and the sacrifices that were made. But by remembering the past, by honoring the strength and resilience of those who came before us, we are reminded of the importance of gratitude, hard work, and community. So as you rest tonight, know that you are part of a long line of survivors, dreamers, and builders. You stand on the shoulders of those who endured unimaginable hardship to bring about the world you now enjoy. And while the world may be different now, the lessons of the past remain just as relevant today. Survival is not just about enduring difficult times. It is about building a future that will allow others to thrive. It is about creating a legacy that will outlive us, and about ensuring that the strength and resilience we have cultivated today will continue to grow long after we are gone. And when you wake in the morning with the warmth of the sun on your face and the promise of a new day ahead, remember that you are part of something much larger than yourself. You are part of a story that spans centuries, a story of survival, hope, and the unwavering belief that no matter how hard the winter may be, spring will come again. Sleep well, for you are safe, and the world is waiting for you to rise with the dawn. The fire burns low, but it will burn again tomorrow, and so will you. As you rest now, feeling the warmth of your home and the safety that surrounds you, take a deep breath and consider how far humanity has come. The winter you are experiencing now, though perhaps still cold and occasionally uncomfortable, pales in comparison to the winters of the past. The medieval world, in all its raw and untamed harshness, has shaped the world you live in today. But the struggle for survival that once defined life has been softened by time, innovation, and progress. And yet, the lessons of those difficult winters are still relevant, for they remind us of the strength and resilience that lie deep within us all. For the people of the past, survival was not just about enduring the cold. It was about pushing the boundaries of human potential. It was about finding ways to adapt to the unyielding challenges of nature and learning to trust that, no matter how hard the season might be, eventually it would come to an end. They didn't know when or how, but they held on to the hope that spring would arrive once again, and through their endurance, they taught us the true meaning of perseverance. Now, you have the comfort of knowing that this struggle is no longer yours. You don't have to gather firewood or ration your food in the same way. You no longer fear for your life with each new snowfall. The advancements of society have given you access to modern comforts. But even so, the spirit of survival and the lessons passed down through generations remain. In your modern life, you are connected to those early survivors by the same innate human drive to keep going. Even when everything around you seems to be falling apart, the fire that once burned low in homes now burns brightly in your heart, fueling your own journey in ways that are uniquely yours. This modern world, built on the foundation of centuries of struggle, offers you an incredible opportunity to live in comfort, but it also comes with a responsibility. The strength of the past is woven into the fabric of your life today. The hardships that people once endured have granted you the life you have now. And it is important to honor their legacy by recognizing that their perseverance made your ease possible. But even in the warmth of your modern surroundings, you can still learn from the winters of the past. The people who faced those brutal winters knew the value of patience, of waiting for the right moment to act, of not rushing to judgment or to change when the time wasn't right. They trusted the seasons. They knew that despite how cold and dark the winter might be, there would always come a time for growth, a time for renewal. In this, there is wisdom in your own life. It's easy to become impatient with challenges, to feel as if things aren't moving fast enough or that you're stuck in a perpetual winter. But the seasons of life are much like the seasons of nature. Even in the most difficult moments, there is growth happening quietly beneath the surface. You may not always see it, but progress is being made. Sometimes you must simply wait for the right moment. The winters of the past also teach us about resourcefulness. In the medieval world, there was no room for waste. Everything had to be used to its fullest potential. Nothing could be thrown away without careful consideration. If a tool broke, it was repaired. If food was scarce, it was rationed. The value of every resource was recognized, and even the smallest scraps were preserved for later use. While we live in a world of abundance, where waste is often taken for granted, the people of the past remind us of the importance of valuing what we have, of not taking resources for granted, and of making the most of every opportunity that comes our way. In our modern lives, we too must learn to be more mindful, to recycle, reuse, and conserve, whether it's time, energy, or physical resources. The lessons of the past continue to guide us. Perhaps one of the greatest lessons the past has to offer is the importance of community. In times of hardship, people came together. Neighbors helped each other gather firewood, share food, and protect one another from the dangers of the cold. They knew that survival depended on the strength of the collective. While we may live in an increasingly individualistic world, the idea of community still holds immense power. We are stronger together, whether it's through helping a friend in need, supporting a cause, or simply being there for others. We continue the legacy of survival by lifting each other up. It is in these moments of unity that we rediscover the power of human connection and the strength that comes from being part of something larger than ourselves. In today's world, we often take for granted the comforts that have been made possible by the hard work of those who came before us. But the legacy of those who lived through harsh winters, who faced unimaginable challenges and overcame them, lives on in the small, everyday choices we make. Every time we endure a tough situation with grace, every time we come together to support one another, we honor the resilience of those who survived much more than we can imagine. Now, as you lie here, reflecting on the warmth that surrounds you, consider what you can carry forward from the strength of the past. How can you build on their legacy of patience, resilience, resourcefulness, and community? In what ways can you take what you've learned from the struggles of the past and apply it to the challenges of your own life? The winters of the past may be long gone, but their lessons remain. It is up to you to carry them into the future and ensure that the warmth of the human spirit continues to burn brightly. No matter the season, tomorrow, when the sun rises and you step into a new day, remember that you are part of a long, unbroken chain of survivors. You are connected to those who faced the brutal winters of centuries ago. And you carry within you the same strength, the same resilience. The past may be behind you, but its lessons are always with you, guiding you forward. Sleep well, for you are part of something greater than yourself, a legacy of endurance, hope, and unbreakable will to keep going, no matter the season. As you drift off, know that the fire of resilience burns bright within you. The night is long, but spring is coming, and you are ready for it. As you drift off to sleep, carry with you the knowledge that you are part of a long line of resilient souls who have endured and thrived, just as you will imagine the many generations before you. People whose names may never be known, but whose struggles and triumphs echo in the very fabric of the world around you. These were the individuals who woke up every day in the harshest conditions, facing challenges that tested their strength, their spirit, and their will to survive. They did not know of the comforts you have today, the technology, the convenience, or even the luxury of modern knowledge. Their lives were defined by survival, by the need to make it through another day, another season, another year. It was not easy for them. Their winters were long, dark, and cold. They did not have the benefits of heated homes, thick blankets, or access to fresh food year-round. They knew hunger. They knew cold that crept deep into their bones, numbness in their limbs, and the fragility of life when the world itself seemed intent on testing their endurance. But they persevered, and in their perseverance, they laid the foundation for the world that you know today. As you sleep, think of these ancestors who faced their own winters, both literal and metaphorical, and yet found ways to carry on. They did not have the privileges you now enjoy, yet they endured, they thrived, and they passed down the strength to you, even if unknowingly. Their legacy is in the resilience that you hold. The same quiet strength that pulses through your veins. The winters of the past, with their cold and darkness, are now distant memories that remind us of the strength found in patience, resourcefulness, and community. The memories of winter's trials are woven into the very essence of human existence. These winters were not just about surviving harsh weather, they were tests of character, endurance, and ingenuity. They were the times when people came together, not out of obligation, but out of necessity. There were no safety nets, no easy ways out. Everyone played their part, whether they were stacking firewood, making sure the crops were stored properly, or caring for the sick. In these times, there was no shame in asking for help. And there was no pride in turning away from others who needed support. The cold and the darkness pushed everyone closer together. Every shared meal, every shared blanket, every shared fire helped to carry people through the night. The harshness of winter taught the true meaning of community, that we are not isolated individuals, but part of a web of connections that gives us strength in the hardest of times. Patience was a virtue carved into the daily lives of those who lived in such conditions. With no way to speed up the seasons or force nature into submission, people learned to wait. They learned to take each day as it came. Knowing that the hardships of winter were inevitable but temporary, there was comfort in that. Even when it felt like the cold would never end. And in the waiting, there was resourcefulness. People used every scrap of food, every bit of wood, every shred of fabric to survive. Waste was unthinkable. The resourcefulness of those who lived through such winters is something that resonates even today. We might not need to use every leftover bit of food or clothing now, but the spirit of being resourceful in our approach to life remains a lesson from the past. Let the quiet of the night embrace you, and may your dreams be filled with warmth, peace, and the quiet assurance that tomorrow brings new possibilities. As you lie here at rest, think of the quiet that surrounds you. The stillness of the night is a reminder that sometimes the best way to move forward is to pause, to take a breath, to center yourself, and to allow yourself to heal. Winter, as it was once experienced, was long and grueling, but it was also a time of rest, perhaps the only time for many to reflect on what they had endured, to appreciate what they had, and to rest in preparation for the hard work that would come with the thawing of spring. The quiet of the night brings an opportunity for rest, not just for the body but for the mind. In the medieval world, people had no distractions from their thoughts. They couldn't escape into their phones or binge-watch shows to distract themselves. The cold and the darkness of winter forced them into reflection. They thought about their families, their communities, their survival. Their quiet nights were filled with contemplation and prayer. Today, you can have a quiet night too. But instead of wondering whether you'll survive the winter, you can rest knowing that you're safe, that the world has changed, and so much of the struggle has already been overcome by those who came before you. As you drift into sleep, let your dreams be filled with warmth, not just from the comfort of your bed, but from the understanding that this warmth, this peace, is the result of centuries of endurance. Tomorrow will come, just as spring always does, bringing new opportunities, new challenges, and new possibilities. Every new day offers a chance for growth, to move beyond the struggles of yesterday, to carry forward the lessons learned, and to step into the future with hope. Good night, and sleep well, for you are safe, and the world is waiting for you to rise with the dawn. You may feel the weight of the world pressing down on you sometimes, the pressures of daily life, the uncertainties of the future, the constant hustle and bustle that can make life feel overwhelming. But take comfort in knowing that you are not facing this world alone. The generations that came before you fought through their own struggles, just as you fight through yours. They passed down the knowledge of perseverance, the strength to survive, and the wisdom to trust that the darkness will eventually fade. Sleep well tonight, knowing that you are part of a long history of people who have faced challenges and survived. Tomorrow is a new day, a new opportunity to build, to grow, and to move forward. The world is waiting for you to rise with the dawn, to face the day with the same quiet strength and resilience that has been passed down through ages. May your rest be peaceful and rejuvenating. And when you awaken, may you carry with you the knowledge that you, too, are a part of this ongoing story of survival, strength, and hope. Good night, and may your dreams be filled with warmth, peace, and the quiet assurance that tomorrow brings new possibilities.